After a failed mission and the
Stay
death
with
of a
me, man.
teammate,
Talk
a
to me.
Navi SEAL chose silence over forgiving himself. He built a life where no one knocked and no one needed him, because needing someone had always been the beginning of loss. Then on a winter night, something scratched at his door. Not a threat, not a man, but a German Shepherd Buckty carrying a newborn baby. Would he keep running from the past or accept this special mission placed before him? Thank you for listening to this moment. Please share your thoughts. Tell us where you're watching from and like and subscribe so we can keep telling stories like this. Snow had begun to retreat from the northern woods, but it did not leave politely. It clung to the shadows beneath pine branches, pooled in the hollows like spilled milk, and hardened overnight into glass-thin crust that cracked under a boot with a sound too loud for a place that worshipped silence. The sky above the lakes was bright, almost cheerful, yet the wind still carried that metallic bite that made a man feel the world was judging him for breathing. Caleb Holloway lived where that wind could reach him easily. His cabin sat back from the county road, tucked behind a line of spruce and birch that swayed like watchmen who never slept. From the outside, it looked like a simple refuge, weathered timber, a narrow porch, a stack of firewood cut clean and squared like a soldier's bed corners. But the details gave him away. The arrangement, the discipline, the way every tool had a place and every place had a reason. Caleb was 38, about 6 feet tall, built lean and compact, strength designed for endurance, not display. His face was clean-shaven, the skin scraped close enough to reveal a square jaw and sharp cheekbones, as if the bones had decided long ago to refuse softness. His hair was dark brown, clipped in a military cut that had grown just a fraction longer than regulation. An unspoken confession that he no longer belonged to anyone's chain of command. Cold northern wind had kissed his light skin into a weathered tan, and his eyes, gray-green, steady, looked like they were always watching a horizon that wasn't there. He wore one outfit the way some men wore a vow. An old olive-gray tactical combat shirt, its fabric softened by years and rinsed pale at the shoulders and cuffs, with faint wear where cold and work had rubbed it honest. Old combat pants in earth brown and moss green, knees scuffed, cargo pockets sagging slightly from constant use. Worn military work boots, a battered military watch that still kept time with the stubbornness of a man who refused to admit he was lost. To the town, Caleb was a rumor with a mailbox. To the woods, he was a quiet animal that had learned how not to be noticed. And to himself, he was a mistake that refused to die. Morning came with chores because chores asked no questions. He chopped wood until his arms warmed and his breath stopped smoking, then checked the roofline for winter damage, then walked the perimeter of the property in a slow, deliberate circuit. Not because anyone was hunting him, not because he expected trouble, because his body did not know how to stop being ready. The forest was bright with thaw. Meltwater slid down trunks in thin ribbons, and the air smelled of sap and damp earth like the world was healing whether he wanted it to or not. In the distance, a woodpecker hammered at a dead tree with the confidence of a creature that believed all noise should have purpose. Caleb envied it. He ate simply, coffee, canned soup, whatever he could. Store. He kept his cabin clean in the way men do when they are trying to control the only thing they can still control. Some people made shrines with candles and prayers. Caleb made shrines with order. But the dead do not stay dead when they are carried in a man's chest. The first time the memory came that day, it came like a hook beneath the ribs, not as a clear scene, not as a full replay, just a sound, a voice, raw and urgent through comms that crackled with dust and panic. "Caleb!" Then silence. He stopped moving without deciding to. His gloved hand hovered above the firewood stack, fingers curling as if trying to hold something that no longer existed. For a moment he tasted sand, smelled smoke, felt the weight of heat pressing on him from all directions. like the air itself had turned into hands. His watch ticked steadily, ruthless, unimpressed. Caleb exhaled and forced the memory down the way he always did. A man could survive many things. He could survive cold, hunger, loneliness. But guilt was a living creature. It fed on time. Years ago, overseas, Caleb had been the one who gave the final call. The mission had been failing. The situation had shifted fast. Too fast. A narrow corridor, a compromised exit, a countdown that was not metaphorical but real. His teammate had been Nolan Briggs. Nolan was the kind of man who looked like he'd been carved rather than born. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a close-cropped blonde head and a grin that always arrived half a second before his words. He had a habit of tapping 2 fingers against his helmet when he was thinking, and he spoke to civilians the way a good brother speaks to a scared kid, firm but gentle, as if confidence could be handed over like a blanket. He'd once told Caleb after a long night and too little sleep, "One day we'll get out, man, and we'll learn how to be normal. Or at least learn how to pretend without scaring the neighbors." It had sounded like a joke then. Now it sounded like a prophecy that had been denied. Nolan had been pinned, not dead yet, not unreachable, just expensive to retrieve. Caleb had assessed the options the way he'd been trained to assess them. Angles, time, risk, survivability. The math had been cruel. Going back could have turned one body into a pile of them. Staying the course meant the mission's primary objective could still be secured. He had made the call. He had left Nolan behind. Officially, it was the right decision. Unofficially, it became the sentence Caleb served in every quiet morning afterward. He had not attended crowds. He had not answered old calls. He had not looked too long at photographs. He had moved north until the world thinned out and the trees were the only witnesses that did not speak. People like to say time healed. Caleb had learned time merely covered the wound with new layers of weather. That afternoon, the wind shifted. Sunlight melted the last crust of snow on the porch roof, and water dripped in a slow rhythm that sounded like a clock insisting on being heard. Caleb repaired a loose hinge, tightened a latch, and avoided looking at the framed photo in the drawer. One picture he kept, face down, because even paper could bleed. By dusk, the sky over the lake turned the color of steel. The trees went black against it, and the cabin's windows lit up like small, stubborn stars. Caleb ate standing up. He washed his cup. He checked the lock twice. He was not afraid of burglars. He was afraid of being needed. Need was the first step toward attachment. Attachment was the first step toward loss. When he finally lay down, he did it like a man lying in a trench, boots off, but readiness still in the bones. The cabin was quiet except for the small groan of wood settling and the far-off sigh of wind sweeping through pines. He stared at the ceiling until his eyes burned. Sleep, when it came in fragments. And then the dream found him. He was back in the corridor. Narrow walls, dust, heat, the smell of cordite and concrete. His hands were steady, but his chest felt too tight, like his ribs had shrunk. The comms crackled. Nolan's voice again. Closer this time, clearer. "Don't leave!" Caleb tried to move, but his legs were heavy as if the floor had turned to tar. "Caleb!" He woke with a sharp inhale, heart thudding once, twice, then settling into that controlled rhythm he hated. Because it meant his body still thought it was at war. The cabin was dark. His watch read 2:17 a.m. He blinked, then looked again, 2:17. A cold line ran down his spine that had nothing to do with weather. He had woken at that time before, not every night, but often enough that it had begun to feel like someone, something, was tapping on the glass of his life, reminding him that time was not only passing, it was returning. Caleb sat up slowly, listening. Silence. Then softly another sound, a faint scrape. Not wind, not settling wood, not the random knock of a branch. It came from the front door. Caleb's hand moved before his mind finished naming what it was doing. He reached for the flashlight on the nightstand, fingers wrapping around it with practiced familiarity. He rose without stepping on the loose board near the bed. He crossed the room with the careful quiet of a man who had learned to make his body disappear. He stopped 3 feet from the door, held his breath, listened, nothing. He almost laughed at himself, almost, because fear would have been easier to explain than the sensation curling in his chest now. This wasn't fear, this felt like the moment before a decision. He shifted his weight, placing his feet like anchors. The flashlight beam cut across the room, glinting off the metal of the door handle. The air smelled faintly of smoke from the stove and pine from the logs stacked by the wall. Then it happened again. A scrape, more deliberate, followed by a soft rhythmic sound like claws testing wood. Caleb's jaw tightened. His heart slowed, not because he was calm, but because training had taught his blood how to obey. He did not speak. He did not call out. He moved closer, and the wood of the door seemed to pulse with the sound on the other side, as if something was waiting there, patient and intent. His mind offered possibilities: stray animal, raccoon, deer stumbling close. But none of those possibilities felt right, because none of them explained the quiet certainty forming in him, that whatever was on the other side of this door had not arrived by accident. Caleb's fingers closed around the handle. The metal was cold enough to sting. He hesitated, not because he was afraid of what might be outside, because he was afraid of what might be asked of him once he opened it. He swallowed, jaw set, eyes fixed on the seam where light from the cabin leaked into the night. And in that thin line of brightness, the scratching stopped. For half a second, the world held its breath. Then came one final sound, so soft it could have been imagined. A low, urgent whine. Caleb's grip tightened. The latch clicked, and the door began to open. Cold air rolled into the cabin the instant Caleb pulled the door wider, sharp enough to sting the inside of his nose. The porch light spilled a thin wedge of gold onto snow-streaked boards, and within that wedge stood a German shepherd, large, black and tan, built the way working dogs were built, all purpose and restraint. The dog did not bark. He stood squarely, shoulders forward, chest broad, tail low but not tucked. Snow clung to the dark saddle of his coat and dotted his whiskers like salt. His ears were mostly upright, though the tips dipped just slightly, as if too many long nights had taught them to relax only halfway. His eyes were a deep amber brown, intelligent and watchful, not wild with panic, but tight with urgency. Caleb's first thought was simple and ugly: someone trained you. His second thought arrived an instant later, colder still, and someone let you go. Only then did Caleb see what the dog held. It was not a toy, not a rabbit, not the kind of offering the wood sometimes placed on a porch. It was fabric, small, pale, heavy with something inside. A baby's jacket, the kind bought for a child someone expected to keep warm. The collar was folded inward and the zipper was half stuck as though it had been yanked in haste. The dog's jaws gripped the shoulder seam with careful pressure. Not crushing, not clumsy. The bundle moved faintly. A sound threaded through the night, thin and fragile. A newborn's breath trying to become a cry. Caleb's body reacted before his mind could form language. His stomach tightened. His shoulders drew back and his hands lifted slightly, empty, open, unsure whether to take or to ward off. The dog stepped forward one pace and stopped, not rushing Caleb, not pushing past him, just placing the bundle within reach, like a soldier delivering something that could not be dropped. Caleb's flashlight beam trembled once as it crossed the dog's face, a faint scar cut behind one ear. Old, healed, the kind you earned by being close to trouble. On his neck was no modern collar, only a worn strip of faded fabric, frayed at the edges as if something else had once been attached and torn away. Caleb swallowed. He had carried wounded men. He had dragged bodies. He had done things that should have turned him to stone. But this was not a mission. It was not an extraction. There was no plan, no perimeter, no backup. There was only a life, small enough to fit inside a jacket, trembling at the edge of his world. His mind threw up defenses like shutters. Call the sheriff, close the door, wait for daylight. This is not your problem. But the dog's eyes held his, steady and intolerably present, and Caleb felt a pressure behind his ribs, an old familiar ache that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with responsibility. He lowered himself slowly, one knee to the porch boards. The cold seeped through his pants immediately, but he barely noticed. He reached for the bundle, with hands that suddenly felt too large, too rough for something this delicate. The dog did not release. Not yet. Caleb paused, breath held in his chest. It was a standoff made of silence and instinct. The dog's muzzle hovered inches from Caleb's fingers. His breathing was controlled, measured, as if he had decided that panic was a luxury he could not afford. Caleb looked up at him. "What are you?" he whispered, voice hoarse from sleep and years of disuse. The dog's ears flicked. He did not blink. Caleb tried again, softer. "Who sent you?" The dog's jaw loosened a fraction, and he placed the bundle into Caleb's hands with a gentleness that made Caleb's throat tighten. The infant was warm, but only barely. The baby's skin, what Caleb could see of it, was pale, flushed at the cheeks, and the lips had a faint bluish tint that made Caleb's training flare like a warning flare. The baby's fists opened and closed weakly as if trying to grasp air. Caleb's chest constricted. He turned, moved backward into the cabin, and the dog followed without hesitation, stepping inside as if he belonged there, as if he had been invited by something older than words. Caleb shut the door quickly, sliding the bolt into place. The sound of the lock felt loud in the small room. Then for a second, Caleb simply stood. The stove's embers glowed faintly. The cabin smelled of pine wood and coffee grounds. The baby made a tiny, strangled noise that might have been a cry if the body had strength to support it. Caleb moved. He laid the infant on the wooden table near the stove, spreading an old blanket beneath. He stripped off his own tactical shirt's outer layer, just enough to create a barrier, and wrapped it around the baby's chest, careful not to smother. His hands were steady, but his thoughts were not. How long, how cold, how close to gone. The dog, still silent, sat near the door, posture upright, eyes on the baby, then on Caleb, then on the window. He was assessing, scanning, guarding. Caleb fed the stove dry wood, coaxing the flames higher. Heat began to bloom across the room like a slow promise. He rummaged through his cupboards for the emergency supplies he'd kept out of habit. Powdered milk packets, a small pot, a clean cloth. He worked with the same calm efficiency that had once guided him through blood and chaos. But there was no radio this time. No voice in his ear telling him what to do next. Only the baby's shallow breaths and the dog's unwavering presence. When Caleb warmed the milk and tested it on his wrist, he did it the way he'd once checked morphine doses, careful, suspicious of his own hope. He folded the clean cloth into a makeshift feeding wick, dabbing tiny amounts against the infant's lips. At first, nothing. Then the baby's mouth moved, a weak latch, a tiny swallow. Caleb exhaled so hard it felt like something inside him unclenched. He didn't realize until that moment how tightly he'd been holding himself together. The baby drank slowly, as if the act of living required conscious effort. Color crept back into the cheeks in small increments. The infant's eyelids fluttered, then fell closed. Caleb's eyes stung. He blinked hard, furious at his own body for betraying him with emotion. Tears were for men who still believed they deserved softness. Caleb did not deserve softness. He deserved quiet. He deserved the punishment of an empty cabin and a life that asked nothing of him. And yet here was a newborn on his table, breathing because he had chosen not to close the door. He sat down heavily in the chair by the stove, elbows on his knees, staring at the baby as if the infant were a riddle written in flesh. The dog rose and padded closer, nails clicking softly on the floorboards. Up close, Caleb could see the dog's coat more clearly. The black saddle across the back, the tan along the legs and chest, the fur thick but not overly long, built for winter work. His paws were large and scarred from travel. His nose was damp, and his whiskers trembled slightly as he sniffed the air near the baby. Careful, controlled. Then the dog looked at Caleb, and Caleb saw something that unsettled him. Not pleading, not fear, expectation, as if the dog believed Caleb would understand what to do next. Caleb's jaw clenched. "I don't know you," he muttered, mostly to himself. He looked at the frayed strip of fabric around the dog's neck. It wasn't a collar. It was a remnant, like a leash that had been cut and left behind. Caleb rose, moved slowly, and crouched beside the dog. He didn't reach for the dog's head, no sudden affection, no forced trust. He simply held his hand out, palm down, letting the dog choose. The dog leaned forward, sniffed, and allowed a brief contact. The cool brush of a nose against Caleb's knuckles. Caleb felt the impact of it in a strange place, behind the sternum, where Nolan's last voice still echoed. He swallowed again, forcing his mind to focus. "All right," he said quietly. "If you're here, it means something happened." The dog's ears flicked toward the window. Caleb followed the direction of that small movement and froze. Outside, beyond the glass, moonlight washed the snow in pale blue. The forest was still, but on the lower edge of the window, barely visible in the thin frost, there were smudges, as if something had pressed close to look in. Caleb's heart slowed into that dangerous calm again. He moved to the window without making noise, peering out from the side rather than straight on. He scanned the tree line, the porch, the darkness between. Nothing. No figures, no headlights, no sound of boots, and yet the dog's posture had shifted, his body angled toward the door, weight forward, ready. Caleb's skin prickled. He was not alone out here. He had never truly been alone. Caleb went back to the table, intending to check the baby's temperature again, but the dog cut across the room and stopped him, not with force, but with a single quiet movement. The German shepherd placed himself between Caleb and the baby. Then with deliberate care, he lowered his head and nudged the infant's jacket, revealing something Caleb hadn't seen before, a tiny tag, stitched into the inner seam. Not a brand label, a hand-sewn marker, crude but intentional, as if someone had done it in a hurry with shaking fingers. 2 letters. C-H. Caleb stared at it until his vision narrowed. His initials. No one in town knew his full name. He didn't use it. He didn't sign for deliveries. He didn't go to church. He didn't attend town meetings. He existed as a silhouette, if he existed at all. And yet someone had marked this child and sent it here, to him. Caleb felt the room tilt slightly, like the cabin itself had shifted on its foundation. The dog lifted his gaze to Caleb's eyes, steady, unblinking, as if to say, "You see now, this isn't random." Caleb's mouth went dry. His mind raced through possibilities, some logical, some impossible. Had the mother known him? Had the baby's father? Was this a message, a warning, a trap, or something worse? Something connected to the reason Caleb had fled in the first place. He forced himself to breathe, one slow pull of air at a time, as if he could inhale clarity. The baby made a small sound in its sleep, a soft hiccup of breath. Caleb's anger at the mystery flared, sharp, protective, irrational. He had spent years trying to disappear, and now the world had found him in the most intimate way it could. Caleb's eyes drifted to the dog's frayed neck strap again, and an ugly thought surfaced. If someone wanted me to receive this, they might also want me to keep it. He looked back at the window. The smudges seemed darker now, though perhaps that was only his mind filling in shadows with dread. The dog remained between him and the baby like a sentry holding a line. Caleb's voice came out low and controlled. "We're leaving at first light." The dog did not move. He simply blinked once, slow, deliberate, as if he had already known Caleb would say that. Caleb spent the rest of the night in a chair by the stove, fully dressed, boots on, watch ticking. He kept the baby close enough to reach with a single movement. The dog lay on the floor near the door, head up, ears tuned to every whisper of sound outside. Every so often, Caleb's gaze slid to the tag again. CH. It burned in his mind like a brand. He had not spoken his name aloud in months. Now it sat in thread against a newborn skin. At some point near dawn, the wind rose. The cabin creaked softly as if it were exhaling. Caleb's eyes grew heavy but refused to close. He'd learned long ago that sleep was a negotiation, and tonight he did not trust the other side of the bargaining table when the first pale light seeped through the trees, turning the snow into silver. Caleb finally moved. He checked the baby's breathing, felt the warmth in the tiny chest, adjusted the blanket. The infant remained asleep, fragile and steady. Caleb gathered supplies, food, water, extra blankets, the powdered milk, a thermos, his keys. He didn't pack much. He never did. The dog rose instantly as if pulled by a silent command. Caleb looked at him. "Orion," he said, the name arriving without thought, like it had been waiting in his throat. "That's what I'm calling you. You okay with that?" The dog's tail gave a small, almost imperceptible sweep. Caleb took it as agreement. He approached the door, hand on the bolt, and paused. He could still choose the old way. He could call the sheriff and step back, let the system absorb this. He could tell himself it wasn't his responsibility. He could pretend the initials were coincidence. But the image of Nolan's face flashed in his mind. Half a grin, 2 fingers tapping his helmet. "Don't leave." Caleb swallowed hard. His throat ached. He pulled the bolt free. The door opened onto a world washed clean by cold light. The forest stood innocent, bright, and silent. But Caleb no longer believed innocence in the woods meant safety. He stepped onto the porch with the baby held tight against his chest, Orion moving at his side like a shadow with teeth. And as Caleb looked at the fresh snow, he saw what the night had tried to hide. A line of boot prints, partly blurred by wind, leading from the tree line toward his cabin. Not animal tracks, not wandering steps, purposeful, straight. Someone had come close. Someone had stood in the dark and watched him open the door. Caleb's grip tightened around the baby. Orion's body stiffened, ears forward, a low rumble vibrating in his chest. Not loud enough to echo, but deep enough to warn. Caleb's voice was barely a whisper, more vow than sentence. "Okay," he said, "now I understand." Morning did not arrive all at once. It crept in thin layers. First a dull silver pressing against the edges of the forest, then a pale wash that softened the snow without warming it. The air carried the smell of thaw and old leaves, and somewhere far off, ice cracked on the lake with a sound like a deep, tired breath. Caleb Holloway stepped off the porch slowly, careful not to disturb more than necessary. The baby was secured against his chest, wrapped in layers of fabric and warmth. Small enough that Caleb could feel each fragile rise and fall of breathing through the jacket. The infant slept, unaware of the calculations unfolding around him. That innocence felt heavier than any pack Caleb had ever carried. Orion moved at his side. In daylight, the German Shepherd looked even more like a working animal. 6 years old by Caleb's estimation, fully grown, with the balanced proportions of a dog bred for endurance rather than speed. His black and tan coat caught the light, unevenly, the darker saddle dull and matte, the tan along his legs brushed with mud from the thaw. His gait was smooth and economical, head level, tail low but loose. He did not rush ahead. He did not lag behind. He stayed exactly where he was needed. Caleb scanned the snow again. The boot prints were clearer now, no longer hidden by darkness. They cut a straight line from the tree line toward the cabin, close enough that whoever made them would have been able to see the porch light flick on. Whoever it was had stood there, watched. Then turned away. Caleb crouched, keeping his back to the cabin. He studied the impressions with a precision that had not dulled despite the years. Adult boots, deep tread, not cheap, not improvised. The spacing suggested an unhurried walk. Someone confident enough to approach and leave without panic. This wasn't a drifter. This was someone who knew where they were. Caleb straightened slowly, jaw tight. "We're not staying," he murmured, more to himself than to Orion. The dog's ears flicked, acknowledging the sound but not the meaning. Orion's attention had shifted to something else entirely. He had stopped moving. Caleb followed the line of the dog's gaze across the yard into the narrow break between the trees where the ground dipped and the snow thinned to damp earth. Orion took one step forward, then another. Not fast, not alarmed, intentional. Caleb hesitated only a second before following. He adjusted his grip on the baby, tightening the wrap just enough to ensure warmth without pressure, and moved carefully down slope. The earth underfoot was soft, the kind that recorded every mistake. The forest swallowed them within a dozen paces. Here the light shifted, birch trunks glowed pale against shadow. Meltwater trickled in shallow channels that cut through old leaves and needles. The air felt close, heavy with scent. Wet bark, soil, something metallic Caleb did not like. Orion slowed. He lowered, his head, nose skimming the ground, then lifted it again, testing the air. His body language changed subtly. Shoulders set, neck stiffened, tail still. He circled once, then stopped beside a patch of disturbed earth. Caleb felt the change before he fully understood it. This place had been touched, not by animals, by hands. Caleb knelt, heart steady in that dangerous way he recognized too well. He brushed aside loose leaves, careful not to destroy what little evidence remained. The soil beneath was darker, freshly turned, and in it, half hidden, as if abandoned rather than buried, lay a small object, a ring, gold scratched, simple. Caleb picked it up slowly, holding it between thumb and forefinger. The metal was cold, damp, but unmistakably human. He turned it, and the inside caught the light. An inscription, worn but legible. 2 names, and a date that was far too recent. Caleb exhaled through his nose, a controlled release that did nothing to ease the weight settling. In his chest, he searched the ground again, more urgently now, and found the second ring a foot away, partially pressed into the mud. 2 rings, 2 people. His gaze lifted instinctively, scanning the surrounding trees, the slope beyond, the path back toward the cabin. No movement, no sound except Orion's breathing and the faint creak of branches. Caleb closed his eyes briefly. He had seen scenes like this before, scattered across deserts and cities and nameless valleys. The details changed. The outcome rarely did. He slipped the rings into his pocket and stood, every sense sharpened. Orion had moved again. The dog padded forward, stopping at a narrow depression in the ground, a shallow hollow not deep enough to be called a grave, but too deliberate to be natural. The earth here was compressed, as if weight had pressed down and been dragged away. Caleb swallowed. "No," he said quietly, though he didn't know what he was refusing. He approached the hollow, careful, methodical. There were no visible remains, no obvious blood. Whoever had done this had worked quickly, efficiently, and had taken what they came for. Caleb's mind assembled the pieces whether he wanted it to or not. A newborn still alive, parents removed, evidence disturbed, not erased. This wasn't an accident, this was a message, or a mistake someone hadn't had time to finish correcting. He straightened and turned back toward the cabin, a cold resolve settling into place. "We leave now," he said again, louder this time. Orion did not argue. They moved quickly but quietly, retracing their steps. Caleb's muscles burned slightly from the tension of carrying the baby while staying alert. The infant stirred once, making a soft sound against Caleb's chest, then settled again. When the cabin came back into view, Caleb slowed, scanning the perimeter. Nothing had changed. No new tracks, no signs of forced entry. Inside, the warmth felt almost obscene. Caleb laid the baby gently on the table again. Checked breathing, color, warmth, still stable, still alive. Orion resumed his post near the door, but his head turned now and then toward the window, toward the woods. Caleb paced once, twice, then stopped. He needed information, and information meant people. That was the part he had been avoiding for years. He pulled a battered phone from a drawer, the kind that stayed powered off until absolutely necessary. He turned it on now, the screen lighting his face in harsh white. One bar of service flickered into existence, then two. Caleb stared at the contacts list, thumb hovering. There was one number he had never deleted, one man who still knew his full name. Caleb pressed call. The ringtone sounded too loud in the small cabin. Orion's ears tilted back briefly at the unfamiliar noise. The line connected after the third ring. "Yeah?" a voice said, low and rough, carrying the weight of too many long nights. "Who is this?" Caleb closed his eyes. "It's Caleb." There was a pause, a long one. Then, "Holloway?" The voice sharpened. "I thought you disappeared." "Mostly," Caleb said. "I need a favor." Another pause, shorter this time. "You don't call unless it's bad." "It's bad," Caleb said. "Where are you?" Caleb gave a location, vague but sufficient. He did not explain more than necessary. He never had. The man on the other end, Agent Marcus Reed of the State Investigative Unit, exhaled slowly. Reed was in his late 40s, lean with graying hair and a face that looked perpetually carved by suspicion. Years earlier, in a joint operation overseas, Caleb had dragged Reed out of a collapsing structure under fire. Reed had never forgotten that. "All right," Reed said finally. "Don't touch anything else. Don't talk to anyone. I'll see what I can find." Caleb ended the call and set the phone down, hands steady. The cabin fell quiet again. He sank into the chair, elbows on knees, staring at the floor. "You're back in it now," a voice in his head said. "You could still walk away." He glanced at the baby, then at Orion. The dog had shifted closer to the table, lying down now, head resting on his paws but eyes open, tracking every movement Caleb made. There was no anxiety in him, no confusion, only watchfulness. Caleb felt something twist in his chest. He hadn't saved Nolan. He hadn't gone back, and every day since, he had lived as if his only penance was absence, but absence hadn't protected anyone. The baby stirred again, more urgently this time. Caleb rose at once, crossing the room to check on him, but before he reached the table, Orion moved. The dog stood, placed himself beside the infant, and did something unexpected. He sat, perfectly straight, eyes forward, ears alert. It wasn't a protective stance, it was a trained one. Caleb froze. That posture, precise, disciplined, was not instinct. It was conditioning, military, search and rescue, law enforcement. Someone had taught this dog to guard a human life at all costs. Caleb's gaze dropped to the faded fabric at Orion's neck again. And this time he noticed something he'd missed in the dim light before of faint stitching marks where an insignia had once been. Removed, deliberately. Caleb felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. "This didn't start last night," he said quietly. Orion did not move. He simply remained at attention, as if waiting for orders he had already decided to obey. Hours passed slowly. Caleb fed the baby again, changed the cloth, monitored warmth. He forced himself to eat, though the food tasted like nothing. Outside, the day brightened fully, the world going about its business without regard for the violence tucked into its edges. By early afternoon, a vehicle approached along the road, a sound Caleb had learned to recognize from a mile away. He did not relax when it stopped. A dark SUV pulled up near the tree line, careful not to drive too close. A man stepped out, tall but slightly stooped, wearing a plain jacket and jeans that did nothing to hide the way he carried himself. Alert, controlled, eyes constantly moving. Agent Marcus Reed looked older than Caleb remembered, thinner, lines etched deeper around his eyes. His beard was neatly trimmed but graying, and his gaze carried the fatigue of someone who had spent decades learning how evil hid behind normal faces. Reed took in the cabin, the woods, the boot prints Caleb hadn't erased. Then he looked at Caleb. "Jesus," Reed said softly, "you weren't kidding." Caleb gestured him inside. Reed's eyes flicked to the dog first, then to the baby. Something unreadable crossed his face. "You going to tell me how a newborn ended up here?" Reed asked. "Not yet," Caleb said, "but I can tell you this wasn't abandonment." Reed nodded once. "I believe you." That surprised Caleb. Reed crouched near the table, examining the infant without touching. "You did good keeping him warm. Another hour out there and—" He trailed off. Caleb waited. Reed straightened. "There have been reports, couples vanishing in remote areas, nothing that stuck long enough to make headlines." Caleb's jaw tightened. This time it stuck. Reed met his gaze. "Because you answered the door." Outside, the wind moved through the trees again, and the cabin creaked softly around them. Caleb looked at the baby, then at Orion, who had resumed his watchful silence. The pieces were falling into place, and he did not like the picture they were forming. Caleb stepped back onto the porch as Reed returned to his vehicle to make calls. The light was different now, less forgiving. The snow reflected it harshly, revealing every footprint, every scar in the ground. Caleb's life had been built on not being seen. Now something had gone to great lengths to find him. He rested a hand on the doorframe, feeling the grain of the wood beneath his palm. He had thought isolation was safety. He had been wrong. Behind him, Orion shifted, a quiet presence, steady and unafraid. Caleb exhaled slowly. Whatever this was, whatever had brought a trained dog and a living child to his threshold, it was no longer something he could step away from. And for the first time in years, he did not turn his back. By late afternoon, the forest had changed its mind. Clouds rolled in from the west, low and thick, flattening the light until the world looked rubbed down to charcoal and ash. The temperature dropped just enough to remind everything alive that winter was not finished arguing. Snowmelt slowed. The air grew heavy with the promise of more weather. Caleb watched the sky from the porch while Agent Reed spoke quietly into his phone by the SUV. Inside the cabin, the baby slept again, fed, warm, wrapped in layers that smelled faintly of pine and smoke. Orion lay near the table, body relaxed but alert, head up, ears working independently like antennae. He did not sleep the way a house dog slept. He rested the way a sentry did, ready without strain. Caleb's jaw stayed tight. Reed finished his call and walked back toward the cabin, boots crunching softly. Up close, the years on him were clearer. Marcus Reed was lean and angular, his face marked by sharp lines and a permanently thoughtful frown. His hair, once dark, had gone mostly gray at the temples. His beard was neatly trimmed, but it did nothing to hide the fatigue etched into his eyes, the look of a man who had spent decades meeting the worst of people and cataloging it quietly. "I've got county units moving," Reed said. "They'll start with the ground you showed me, then work outward. Low profile. No lights." Caleb nodded. "They won't find much." "No," Reed agreed, "but they'll find enough." Reed glanced inside, eyes settling briefly on the baby. Something unreadable crossed his face. "You sure you're ready for what comes next?" Caleb didn't answer right away. He wasn't sure of anything anymore, except that turning away had stopped being an option the moment he'd taken the baby into his arms. Before he could respond, Orion rose smoothly and moved toward the window, body angling toward the road. His ears went forward, tail lifting slightly, not alarmed, but attentive. Caleb followed the dog's gaze. A vehicle was coming. Not Reed's, not law enforcement. A battered pickup truck rolled slowly down the road, tires hissing through slush. It stopped a respectful distance from the cabin, engine idling. The driver's door opened and a woman stepped out. She moved with the caution of someone who knew this road well. She was in her early 30s, average height but slender, built wiry rather than soft. Her coat was thick and practical, faded denim layered over wool. Dark blonde hair was braided tightly down her back, practical and unadorned, with a few loose strands brushing her cheek where the wind had worked them free. Her skin was fair but weathered, touched by sun and cold in equal measure. She had the look of someone accustomed to work that left marks. She paused when she saw the SUV, eyes narrowing slightly, not fearful but assessing. Then she noticed Caleb. Recognition flickered across her face. "Caleb?" she called, voice steady, carrying easily through the cold air. "That you?" Caleb straightened. "Sarah," he said, surprised despite himself. Sarah Miller lived 3 miles down the road, near the bend where the trees opened toward the river. They weren't friends, they weren't strangers. They occupied that quiet space rural people often shared. Mutual recognition without intrusion. She approached slowly, hands visible, gaze flicking briefly to Reed before returning to Caleb. "Saw the SUV. Thought maybe something was wrong." Reed stepped forward, offering a nod. "Marcus Reed, State Investigations." Sarah's eyebrows lifted a fraction, but she didn't retreat. "Figures," she said calmly. Her eyes moved again, this time to Orion, who stood near the door like a carved statue. Something softened in her expression. "That yours?" she asked. "Not exactly," Caleb said. Sarah studied the dog with a practiced eye. "He's not stray." "No," Caleb agreed. Her gaze shifted, and then she saw the baby. She stopped walking. The change in her was immediate and unmistakable. Her shoulders slackened, breath catching just slightly, as if some internal tension had been released all at once. "Oh," she said quietly. Caleb felt an unexpected knot form in his chest. Sarah stepped closer, movements slow and deliberate, the way one approached something fragile. "Is he—" "He's alive," Caleb said. "For now." She nodded, eyes shining but controlled. "You need help?" It wasn't a question rooted in curiosity. It was an offer shaped by experience. Sarah had lost her husband 2 winters ago when his truck slid off an icy logging road. She had survived that season by stubbornness alone, by splitting wood herself, fixing her own roof, refusing to leave the land that had nearly killed her. Loss had not made her brittle, it had made her precise. "I might," Caleb said. Reed watched the exchange, saying nothing. Sarah glanced at the clouds. "Storm's coming. Not a bad one, but enough to make roads ugly by nightfall." Caleb nodded. He already felt it in his bones. Sarah looked back at the baby, then at Orion. "If you're going to town," she said carefully, "you won't want to wait too long." Caleb hesitated. Town meant exposure, questions, systems. It also meant warmth, medical care, witnesses. "We're leaving," he said finally. Sarah met his gaze, searching his face, not prying but reading. "You don't look like a man who planned to," she said softly. "No," Caleb admitted. "I didn't." She gave a small, understanding nod. "I've got supplies in the truck. Formula, blankets, I keep them for emergencies." Reed's eyes flicked to Caleb, a silent question. Caleb considered it for half a second, then nodded. "That would help." Sarah moved back to her truck and retrieved a canvas bag, worn but clean. She handed it over without ceremony. "You'll want to keep him fed regularly," she said, voice gentle but firm, "and warm, and watched." Caleb managed a faint smile. "We've got the last part covered." Sarah's gaze dropped to Orion, who met it calmly. She smiled then, real and brief. "I see that." She stepped back, giving space. "If you need a place to stop before town, my place is open." Reed cleared his throat. "We'll keep that in mind." Sarah nodded. "You do that." She looked at Caleb one last time. "Be careful." Then she returned to her truck and drove off, tires crunching, disappearing around the bend as quietly as she'd arrived. The road fell silent again. Caleb let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Good woman," Reed said. "Yeah," Caleb agreed. Reed checked his watch. "County units will work through the night. I'll stay close, but I can't be with you every step." "I know," Caleb said. Reed hesitated, then added, "Whatever you're thinking of doing, don't do it alone." Caleb didn't answer. He packed efficiently, supplies first, then the baby, secured against his chest. Orion stayed close, adjusting his position instinctively, never getting underfoot. Before leaving, Caleb walked the cabin one last time. The table, the stove, the chair by the window. This place had been a refuge from memory. Now it felt like a staging ground. They stepped onto the road just as the first flakes of new snow began to fall, slow, deliberate, each one catching light before vanishing into the slush. Caleb moved with purpose, boots finding sure footing, body angled to shield the baby from wind. Orion matched his pace perfectly. They hadn't gone more than 100 yards when Orion stopped. Caleb halted instantly, heart spiking. "What is it?" he whispered. Orion turned his head slightly, not toward the woods this time, but toward the sky. Caleb followed his gaze. The clouds overhead parted briefly, revealing a narrow strip of pale blue. For a moment, sunlight broke through, illuminating the road ahead in an almost unnatural clarity. Then it was gone. The snow resumed, thicker now. Caleb frowned. "Okay," he murmured, unsure why the moment unsettled him so deeply. They continued. Half a mile down the road, Orion slowed again. This time he lowered his head and began to pull gently but insistently toward a narrow trail that cut off through the tree. Caleb resisted. "No," he whispered. "Town's that way." Orion did not relent. He braced his paws and leaned back, strength controlled, eyes fixed on Caleb with an intensity that made Caleb's pulse jump. "Orion," Caleb said more sharply now. The dog let out a low sound, not a growl, not a whine, something in between, a warning. Caleb's mind raced. He scanned the road ahead, empty, quiet, too quiet. Then he heard it, faint, distant, the sound of another engine approaching. Fast. Caleb's blood went cold. Orion tugged again, harder this time. Teeth catching the edge of Caleb's sleeve. Careful not to tear, but impossible to ignore. Caleb understood in a flash. The road was no longer safe. Without another word, he stepped off the road and into the trees, letting Orion lead. The trail was narrow and slick, barely visible beneath fresh snow. Caleb moved carefully, muscles burning as he adjusted his weight to protect the baby while navigating uneven ground. Branches clawed at his jacket. Cold seeped into his boots. Behind them, the engine sound grew louder, then faded. Caleb did not look back. They emerged into a small clearing a few minutes later, hidden from the road by a thick stand of spruce. Caleb paused, breath ragged, heart pounding. Orion released his sleeve and sat, panting lightly, eyes still trained in the direction they'd come from. Caleb crouched, pressing his forehead briefly to the baby's hat, grounding himself in the warmth and reality of the small body he carried. "Good call," he whispered to Orion. The dog's tail flicked once. Caleb rose slowly, scanning the clearing. Whatever was happening now, it had moved beyond coincidence. Someone was searching, and Orion had known. They waited in the trees until the light began to fail, the snow thickening into a steady curtain. When Caleb finally moved again, he chose a different path, longer, less direct, but safer. By the time the first lights of town appeared faintly through the tree, Caleb felt the weight of exhaustion settle into his bones. He didn't welcome it. He accepted it. The baby stirred again, and Caleb adjusted the wrap, murmuring softly. Behind him, Orion moved without sound, a dark shape against the snow, loyal and unyielding. Caleb no longer doubted one thing. This dog had not simply brought the child to him, he had brought him away from something. And whatever that something was, it was still close enough to be dangerous. The town did not announce itself. It emerged gradually, as if reluctant to interrupt the forest's long conversation with silence. First came the thinning of trees, then a sagging fence half buried in snow. Then the faint glow of lights smudged against the early evening sky. The road widened, smoothed by plows and patience, and suddenly there were houses, close enough to hear each other breathe. Caleb slowed his pace. The baby slept against his chest, bundled tight, warm now in a way that felt almost miraculous. Each small breath steadied him, anchored him to the present. Orion stayed at his left side, posture calm, head moving in slow arcs as he scanned storefronts, windows, corners. He did not pull, he did not hesitate. This place, at least for the moment, did not feel like a threat. The town of Birch Hollow had once been a logging stop, its bones still visible in the heavy beams of the old buildings and the wide doors that hinted at machinery long gone. Now it lived, quietly sustained by winter tourism, fishing, and the stubborn refusal of its people to leave land that remembered them. Caleb felt those eyes even before he saw them. A few people paused as he passed, a man locking up a hardware store, broad and square-faced with a gray mustache that twitched as he frowned. A woman sweeping snow from her stoop, tall and sharp-featured, hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, a teenager leaning against a truck, curiosity poorly hidden behind practiced indifference. No one stopped him, but no one missed him either. They noticed the baby. They noticed the dog. And they noticed the way Caleb moved. Protective, alert, a man who looked like he had not come here by accident. Caleb headed straight for the clinic. It was a modest building near the center of town, painted white with green trim, its windows glowing warmly against the gray dusk. A simple sign swung gently in the wind, Birch Hollow Medical. He pushed the door open with his shoulder. Warmth hit him like a wave. Inside, the smell of antiseptic mingled with coffee and wool coats. A woman behind the desk looked up sharply, then stood so quickly her chair scraped the floor. "Oh my God," she said softly. Her name was Helen Brooks. She was in her early 40s, average height, sturdy in the way of someone who worked long hours on her feet. Her brown hair was cut just above the shoulders, practical and streaked faintly with silver. Her face was open, kind, but carried the careful seriousness of someone who had learned not to waste reactions on things she could not change. She took in the baby first, then Caleb, then Orion. "Come," she said immediately, already moving. "Room 3. Now." Caleb followed without question. Helen guided them into a small exam room, motions precise but gentle. "You can set him here," she instructed, pulling gloves from a box and snapping them on. "You did well keeping him warm." Caleb stepped back only when she nodded. He stayed close, hands hovering uselessly, heart pounding in a way that felt foreign and unwelcome. Helen examined the baby carefully, checking vitals, listening to breathing, assessing skin color and reflexes. Her expression tightened, then eased. "He's stable," she said finally. "Cold exposure, yes, but no immediate trauma." Caleb released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Helen looked up at him then, eyes sharp. "Where did you find him?" "Near my place," Caleb said. "In the woods." She glanced at Orion, who sat by the door quiet as stone. "With the dog?" "Yes." Helen hesitated. "We've had reports." Caleb's jaw set. "I figured." Before she could continue, the door opened again. A man entered, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair cropped close and a beard trimmed tight along a hard jawline. He wore a sheriff's jacket that had seen years of winters, and his eyes, steel gray, assessing, moved, quickly taking in the scene. Sheriff Tom Keller had grown up in Birch Hollow. Loss had shaped him early, a brother gone to opioids, a father lost to a logging accident. It had made him steady rather than bitter. Reactions cost time. Keller didn't waste either. "You Caleb Holloway?" Keller asked. "Yes." Keller nodded once. "Sheriff Keller, Agent Reed called ahead." Caleb inclined his head slightly. Keller looked at the baby, then at Orion. "Hell of a way to come to town." Caleb didn't argue. Helen finished her assessment and stepped back. "He'll need monitoring overnight. I can do what I can here, but the hospital an hour south would be better." Keller's jaw tightened. "Weather's turning." Caleb met his gaze. "I'll take him wherever he needs to go." Keller studied him for a long moment, as if weighing something invisible. "You ever think about how many stories this town keeps quiet?" he asked. Caleb said nothing. Keller turned toward the door. "I'll make some calls." Helen removed her gloves. "You should sit," she told Caleb gently. "You look like you've been carrying this day longer than it's lasted." Caleb lowered himself into a chair, exhaustion finally catching him. Orion settled at his feet, body warm and solid, a presence that required nothing but offered everything. Minutes passed. The clinic hummed softly with restrained urgency, phones ringing low, footsteps moving with purpose. Outside, snow began to fall again, thicker now, each flake catching the light before disappearing. Caleb watched the baby sleep, and for the first time something inside him cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, but enough to let a thought through that terrified him more than any danger. What if he doesn't belong to anyone else now? Orion stirred. Not abruptly, not alarmed. He rose, moved to the window and stared. Caleb followed his gaze. Across the street, reflected faintly in the glass, of a closed diner stood a man. He was tall, wearing a dark coat, hat pulled low. He didn't move, didn't approach, didn't look away, he simply watched. Caleb felt the old instincts ignite. sharp and electric. The man lifted a hand slowly, not in greeting, but in acknowledgement. Then he turned and walked away, vanishing between buildings before Caleb could move. Orion let out a low, almost inaudible sound. Not fear, recognition. Caleb's pulse hammered. Someone knew where he was. Sheriff Keller returned moments later, unaware or pretending to be of what had just happened. "Hospital transport's delayed," Keller said. "Storm's closing roads faster than expected. He'll stay here tonight." Helen nodded. "That's fine, I'll watch him." Caleb stood. "I'm staying." Keller studied him. "That wasn't a request." Caleb's eyes were steady. "Neither was that." A beat passed. Then Keller nodded once. "All right." The night deepened. The clinic lights dimmed. The baby slept under Helen's careful watch. Caleb sat nearby, hands clasped, thoughts racing. He replayed the image of the man in the window, the calm, the certainty. That wasn't curiosity, that was confirmation. Orion lay alert, eyes half-lidded but awake. Whatever had begun in the woods had followed them here. And Birch Hollow, quiet, watchful Birch Hollow, was about to remember something it had tried very hard to forget. Caleb leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He had run once. He would not do it again. Night settled over Birch Hollow with a patience that felt deliberate. Snow continued to fall, not in a storm, but in a steady curtain that softened edges and muffled sound. Streetlights cast dull halos onto empty roads, and the town drew inward the way small places always did when something unsettled their rhythm. Inside the clinic, time slowed. The baby slept in a warmed bassinet near the nurse's station, chest rising and falling in a fragile but steady rhythm. Helen Brooks moved quietly, her presence calm and practiced, checking vitals, adjusting blankets, recording notes in neat, economical handwriting. She had seen too many nights like this to dramatize them, and too many outcomes to take them lightly. Caleb sat in a chair against the wall, arms resting on his knees, hands clasped loosely. His body was still, but his mind was anything but. Years of training had taught him how to wait without appearing tense, how to watch without staring, how to let time pass without letting his guard down. Orion lay at his feet, head up, eyes open. The German shepherd's breathing was slow and controlled, but his attention never fully relaxed. Every time the door opened, every time footsteps passed in the hallway, his ears shifted, his gaze tracking movement with quiet precision. Caleb had started to trust that. Sheriff Tom Keller stood near the front desk, speaking in low tones with one of his deputies. Up close, the sheriff's presence filled the room, not with authority that demanded obedience, but with the kind that came from familiarity. He knew these people. He knew their histories, their grudges, their habits, and that, Caleb knew, could be both a strength and a liability. Keller crossed the room and stopped a few feet away. "Agent Reed's still coordinating with the county," he said quietly. "Weather's slowing everything." Caleb nodded. "Figures." Keller studied him for a moment. "You staying the night?" "Yes." "You don't have to," Keller said. "We can—" "I know," Caleb interrupted gently, "but I am." Keller didn't argue. He only nodded once, as if he'd expected that answer all along. The minutes stretched. At some point, Helen brought Caleb a mug of coffee. He accepted it without comment, the warmth seeping into his palms. The bitterness grounded him, tethered him to the here and now. He watched the baby sleep. It occurred to him, not for the first time, how strange it was that such a small life could reorder the priorities of a man who had once weighed decisions in terms of acceptable losses. He looked down at Orion. The dog's eyes met his briefly, then returned to the room. "You ever wonder," Caleb murmured under his breath, "why some things find us instead of the other way around?" Orion's tail thumped once against the floor. Not agreement, acknowledgement. Hours later, how many, Caleb couldn't say, The clinic door opened again. A woman stepped inside, stamping snow from her boots. She was in her late 30s, average height, slim but strong, with dark hair pulled back into a loose knot that practical necessity, not vanity, had dictated. Her coat was thick and worn, her gloves mismatched. Her face was pale from the cold, but her eyes were sharp and observant. This was Mary Collins. She worked with the county as a licensed social worker and pediatric nurse, an unusual overlap born from a past that had forced her to learn how systems failed children long before they helped them. Years ago, she had lost her young daughter and husband in a highway accident during a relocation process gone wrong. Since then, Mary had redirected her grief into methodical compassion. She did not rush. She did not soften the truth. She carried kindness like a tool, not a performance. Mary paused when she saw the baby, her expression tightening almost imperceptibly before smoothing into professional calm. "I'm Mary," she said quietly, approaching. "I was called in." Helen greeted her with a nod and brief update. Mary listened carefully, asking only essential questions, then bent to examine the infant with practiced hands. "He's strong," she said after a moment. "Cold, frightened, but strong." Caleb felt a strange relief at the word, as if it applied to more than just the baby. Mary looked up at him. "You're the one who brought him in?" "Yes." Her gaze held his, not interrogative, but attentive. "You've done this before," she said. Caleb hesitated. "Not like this." She accepted that answer without probing. Orion rose slowly and moved closer, positioning himself near Mary but not between her and the baby. His posture was alert, neutral, evaluating. Mary noticed immediately. "He's trained," she said softly. "Yes," Caleb replied. "We think so." Mary studied the dog with interest. "He's not anxious?" she noted. "That tells me he trusts the situation, or he trusts you." Caleb didn't respond. Mary straightened. "I'll need to file a report," she said gently. "Temporary custody procedures, it doesn't mean the child will be taken from you immediately." Caleb's jaw tightened. "I know how the system works," Mary nodded. "Then you also know it works better when people stay." Her words settled heavier than she intended. Caleb looked away. As Mary prepared paperwork at the desk, Orion suddenly stiffened. Not in alarm, in focus. He lifted his head and stared at the far end of the hallway where the lights dimmed toward the storage rooms. Caleb followed his gaze. Nothing moved. No footsteps, no voices, just shadow. Then Orion stood and walked forward, slow and deliberate, stopping exactly at the boundary where light gave way to dark. He did not bark. He did not growl. He simply sat, facing the darkness. Mary noticed. "That's unusual," she murmured. Caleb's pulse quickened. "Orion," he said quietly. The dog did not turn. Caleb rose and stepped beside him, scanning the corridor. His senses prickled, not with fear but with the recognition of a familiar pattern. This was how Nolan used to stand guard, silent, still, refusing to retreat. A sound came then, barely audible, a door closing, somewhere deeper in the clinic. Caleb moved instantly. Sheriff Keller was already on his radio. "Unit check," Keller said sharply. "Anyone in storage?" Static answered. Orion let out a low sound, not aggressive, but urgent. When Keller's deputies swept the hallway moments later, they found the storage door unlocked and empty. But the window at the far end, small, high, and usually sealed for winter, stood open. Snow drifted in through the gap. Someone had been inside and had left without being seen. The clinic locked down after that. Deputies searched the perimeter. Keller spoke in low, controlled tones, issuing orders without panic. Mary moved the baby to a more secure room without argument. Helen double-checked locks and windows with the precision of someone who had lived through emergencies before. Caleb stood in the middle of it all, heart steady, mind clear. This wasn't random. This wasn't coincidence. Someone had followed them. Someone had come close enough to risk being seen, and someone had been stopped, not by locks or alarms, but by a dog who refused to look away. Mary approached Caleb once the tension eased slightly. "They'll increase protection tonight," she said. "But tomorrow—" "I know," Caleb said. She hesitated, then spoke carefully. "You don't have to do this alone." Caleb met her gaze. "I've been alone long enough to know when it stops working." She studied him, something like respect flickering across her expression. Keller joined them. "We'll keep the child here overnight," he said. "Secure, quiet. In the morning, we'll talk next steps." Caleb nodded. He returned to the chair beside the baby's room, Orion settling at his feet once more. The dog leaned against his leg briefly, a small grounding weight. Caleb rested a hand on Orion's shoulder, fingers sinking into coarse fur. "Good work," he murmured. Orion closed his eyes for just a second. Outside, the snow fell thicker, covering tracks, erasing evidence. Inside, lines were being drawn. Caleb understood something now that he had avoided for years. Running had never saved anyone. Staying might. And this time, when the darkness pressed close, he did not step away from it. He stood his ground. Dawn arrived quietly, as if unwilling to disturb what the night had exposed. Snow still fell, but lighter now, thin flakes drifting sideways, settling without conviction. Birch Hollow woke in fragments, a door opening somewhere down the street, the low rumble of a plow clearing a side road, the distant bark of a dog greeting a morning that felt heavier than most. Inside the clinic, the lights remained dim. The baby slept through it all. Caleb hadn't. He sat in the same chair he'd occupied for hours, spine straight, shoulders loose but ready. Fatigue pressed into him, but he had learned long ago that exhaustion did not excuse inattention. Orion lay at his feet, curled but alert, eyes opening every time someone passed the doorway. Sheriff Keller returned just after sunrise, boots dusted with snow, jaw set. "We've got something," he said quietly. Caleb stood immediately. Keller led him to a small office at the back of the clinic, walls lined with outdated health, posters and a single window fogged from the cold. Agent Marcus Reed stood inside, coat still on, coffee untouched in his hand. His face looked tighter than it had the night before, less patient. Mary Collins stood beside him, arms folded loosely, expression composed but intent. Reed nodded once at Caleb. "Morning. What did you find?" Caleb asked. Reed set the coffee down, unused. "County units found more disturbed ground about a mile west of your cabin. Not deep, not finished." Caleb's chest tightened. "No bodies," Reed continued, "but personal effects, IDs, wallets, belongings that were meant to be destroyed and weren't." Mary inhaled slowly through her nose. "2 victims?" Caleb asked. Reed shook his head. 3 confirmed, possibly more. The words settled like ice. Reed pulled a thin folder from his coat and slid it across the desk. Inside were photos, printed quickly, grainy but unmistakable. A man and a woman, late 20s, early 30s. The man had a narrow face, dark hair cut short, stubble along his jaw. The woman's hair was long and dark, her features soft even in the harsh light of an ID photo. They stood close together, shoulders touching. The quiet intimacy of people who trusted the world enough to smile at it. Caleb's throat tightened. "They were reported missing 2 weeks ago," Reed said. "Driving north. planned to stop in Birch Hollow overnight before heading further into the state. Caleb closed his eyes briefly. Mary leaned forward, voice gentle but precise. They were expecting a child. Caleb looked up sharply. Yes, Mary confirmed. First pregnancy. Late term. The woman, Emily Hartman, went into labor early. Caleb's pulse thudded in his ears. Emily. The name hit him harder than he expected, not because it was rare, but because it echoed something buried. He swallowed, forcing himself to focus. Reed continued, hospital records show she checked into a rural ER about 40 miles south, delivered the baby, healthy, discharged early against recommendation. Why? Caleb asked. Reed's mouth tightened. Fear. Someone was following them. Silence stretched. Mary's gaze flicked to Caleb. They didn't trust the system, she said softly. Not fully. Caleb exhaled slowly. So they ran, he said. Yes, Reed replied, and whoever was hunting them caught up. Caleb leaned back against the wall, the weight of it pressing down hard. Mary opened another file. There's more. She turned the page and revealed a handwritten note, photographed and enlarged. Caleb recognized it instantly. The same stitching, the same careful shaking and tension. 2 letters, written at the bottom of the note. C.H. Caleb felt the room tilt. They knew your name, Reed said. Not personally, but indirectly. How? Caleb asked, though part of him already knew. Reed met his eyes. Because of a man named Nolan Briggs. The air left Caleb's lungs in a rush. Reed continued, voice steady. Emily Hartman was Nolan's cousin. Caleb stared. She knew he served, Reed went on, knew he died on a mission, knew his team leader's name because Nolan talked about you in his letters. Caleb's chest constricted painfully. Mary spoke carefully now. When things started going wrong, Emily remembered those letters, remembered the name Nolan trusted. Caleb shook his head slowly. I didn't save him. No, Mary said gently. But he believed you would save someone else. The words cut deep. Reed leaned against the desk. Emily and her husband tried to disappear, but the man following them, this isn't his first time. He targets couples in transit, isolated, vulnerable. He doesn't rush. He waits until there's no help close enough. Caleb clenched his fists. What about the baby? He asked. Reed's gaze softened just a fraction. Emily gave birth alone, then fled with the child. She was injured, exhausted, but she made one decision right. She sent the baby to me, Caleb said quietly. Mary nodded. Through the one protector she still had. All eyes shifted to Orion. The dog lay near the door, head resting on his paws, ears angled toward the room. He had not moved since they entered. He belonged to Nolan, Reed added. Military working dog. Retired after an injury. Nolan took him in. Caleb felt something break open in his chest. Nolan trained him, he whispered. Yes, Reed said. And when Nolan died, Orion went to family. Emily, he stayed with them. Caleb closed his eyes. The circle completed itself with brutal clarity, as if summoned by the weight of the moment Orion stood. He walked into the office slowly, deliberately, and stopped in front of Caleb. Then, for the first time since Caleb had known him, Orion did something unexpected. He sat and placed one paw gently against Caleb's boot. The contact was light, intentional, not a command, a choice. Caleb felt his vision blur. Nolan used to do that, tap a foot, a shoulder, small gestures that said, I'm here, you're not alone. Caleb knelt without thinking, resting a hand on Orion's head. The dog leaned into the touch, eyes closing briefly. Mary looked away, blinking. Reed cleared his throat. The moment passed, but its meaning did not. What happens now? Caleb asked. Reed straightened. We hunt him, carefully. He's local, knows these roads, but he made a mistake coming into town. Keller stepped into the doorway then. We've got patrols out. State's sending support. Caleb nodded. I'll help. Reed studied him. Officially? Caleb met his gaze. Unofficially. Reed considered it, then nodded once. You stay within sight. You follow instructions. Caleb accepted that. Mary stepped closer. And the baby? Caleb's jaw tightened. I won't let him disappear. Mary held his gaze. Then we'll do this the right way. The baby stirred faintly in the next room, a soft sound that cut through the tension. Caleb turned toward it instinctively. He needs a name, Mary said quietly. Caleb hesitated. Then softly, Noah. Mary smiled gently. Reed raised an eyebrow. Fits. Caleb looked down at his hands, then back up. I won't run, he said. Not this time. Reed nodded. Good. Outside, the snow finally slowed, the town exhaling after a long night. Caleb walked back to the baby's room, Orion at his side. He stood over the bassinet watching Noah sleep, chest rising steadily. The past had found him, not to punish, but to finish something that had been left undone. Caleb rested a hand on the edge of the bassinet, the other on Orion's shoulder. For the first time since Nolan's last call, Caleb felt the weight shift, not lighter but bearable. The line he had never crossed had been crossed for him, and now he would hold it. Dawn arrived quietly, as if unwilling to disturb what the night had exposed. Snow still fell, but lighter now, thin flakes drifting sideways, settling without conviction. Birch Hollow woke in fragments, a door opening somewhere down the street, the low rumble of a plow clearing a side road, the distant bark of a dog greeting a morning that felt heavier than most. Inside the clinic, the lights remained dim. The baby slept through it all. Caleb hadn't. He sat in the same chair he'd occupied for hours, spine straight, shoulders loose but ready. Fatigue pressed into him, but he had learned long ago that exhaustion did not excuse inattention. Orion lay at his feet, curled but alert, eyes opening every time someone passed the doorway. Sheriff Keller returned just after sunrise, boots dusted with snow, jaw set. We've got something, he said quietly. Caleb stood immediately. Keller led him to a small office at the back of the clinic, walls lined with outdated health, posters in a single window fogged from the cold. Agent Marcus Reed stood inside, coat still on, coffee untouched in his hand. His face looked tighter than it had the night before, less patient. Mary Collins stood beside him, arms folded loosely, expression composed but intent. Reed nodded once at Caleb. Morning. What did you find? Caleb asked. Reed set the coffee down, unused. County units found more disturbed ground about a mile west of your cabin. Not deep, not finished. Caleb's chest tightened. No bodies, Reed continued, but personal effects. IDs, wallets, belongings that were meant to be destroyed and weren't. Mary inhaled slowly through her nose. 2 victims? Caleb asked. Reed shook his head. 3 confirmed, possibly more. The words settled like ice. Reed pulled a thin folder from his coat and slid it across the desk. Inside were photos printed quickly, grainy but unmistakable. A man and a woman, late 20s, early 30s. The man had a narrow face, dark hair cut short, stubble along his jaw. The woman's hair was long and dark, her features soft even in the harsh light of an ID photo. They stood close together, shoulders touching, the quiet intimacy of people who trusted the world enough to smile at it. Caleb's throat tightened. They were reported missing 2 weeks ago, Reed said, driving north. Planned to stop in Birch Hollow overnight before heading further into the state. Caleb closed his eyes briefly. Mary leaned forward, voice gentle but precise. They were expecting a child. Caleb looked up sharply. Yes, Mary confirmed. First pregnancy, late term. The woman, Emily Hartman, went into labor early. Caleb's pulse thudded in his ears. Emily. The name hit him harder than he expected, not because it was rare, but because it echoed something buried. He swallowed, forcing himself to focus. Reed continued. Hospital records show she checked into a rural ER about 40 miles south. Delivered the baby, healthy, discharged early against recommendation. Why? Caleb asked. Reed's mouth tightened. Fear. Someone was following them. Silence stretched. Mary's gaze flicked to Caleb. They didn't trust the system, she said softly. Not fully. Caleb exhaled slowly. So they ran, he said. Yes, Reed replied. And whoever was hunting them caught up. Caleb leaned back against the wall, the weight of it pressing down hard. Mary opened another file. There's more. She turned the page and revealed a handwritten note, photographed and enlarged. Caleb recognized it instantly, the same stitching, the same careful shaking intention. 2 letters written at the bottom of the note, C.H. Caleb felt the room tilt. They knew your name, Reed said. Not personally, but indirectly. How? Caleb asked, though part of him already knew. Reed met his eyes. Because of a man named Nolan Briggs. The air left Caleb's lungs in a rush. Reed continued, voice steady. Emily Hartman was Nolan's cousin. Caleb stared. She knew he served, Reed went on. Knew he died on a mission. Knew his team leader's name because Nolan talked about you in his letters. Caleb's chest constricted painfully. Mary spoke carefully now. When things started going wrong, Emily remembered those letters, remembered the name Nolan trusted. Caleb shook his head slowly. I didn't save him. No, Mary said gently, but he believed you would save someone else. The words cut deep. Reed leaned against the desk. Emily and her husband tried to disappear, but the man following them, this isn't his first time. He targets couples in transit, isolated, vulnerable. He doesn't rush. He waits until there's no help close enough. Caleb clenched his fists. What about the baby? He asked. Reed's gaze softened just a fraction. Emily gave birth alone, then fled with the child. She was injured, exhausted, but she made one decision right. She sent the baby to me, Caleb said quietly. Mary nodded. Through the one protector she still had. All eyes shifted to Orion. The dog lay near the door, head resting on his paws, ears angled toward the room. He had not moved since they entered. He belonged to Nolan, Reed added. Military working dog, retired after an injury. Nolan took him in. Caleb felt something break open in his chest. Nolan trained him, he whispered. Yes, Reed said. And when Nolan died, Orion went to family, Emily. He stayed with them. Caleb closed his eyes. The circle completed itself with brutal clarity. As if summoned by the weight of the moment, Orion stood. He walked into the office slowly, deliberately, and stopped in front of Caleb. Then, for the first time since Caleb had known him, Orion did something unexpected. He sat and placed one paw gently against Caleb's boot. The contact was light, intentional, not a command, a choice. Caleb felt his vision blur. Nolan used to do that, tap a foot, a shoulder, small gestures that said, I'm here, you're not alone. Caleb knelt without thinking, resting a hand on Orion's head. The dog leaned into the touch, eyes closing briefly. Mary looked away, blinking. Reed cleared his throat. The moment passed, but its meaning did not. What happens now? Caleb asked. Reed straightened. We hunt him. Carefully. He's local. Knows these roads, but he made a mistake coming into town. Keller stepped into the doorway then. We've got patrols out, states sending support. Caleb nodded. I'll help. Reed studied him. Officially? Caleb met his gaze. Unofficially. Reed considered it, then nodded once. You stay within sight. You follow instructions. Caleb accepted that. Mary stepped closer. And the baby? Caleb's jaw tightened. I won't let him disappear. Mary held his gaze. Then we'll do this the right way. The baby stirred faintly in the next room, a soft sound that cut through the tension. Caleb turned toward it instinctively. He needs a name, Mary said quietly. Caleb hesitated. Then softly, Noah. Mary smiled gently. Reed raised an eyebrow. Fits. Caleb looked down at his hands, then back up. I won't run, he said. Not this time. Reed nodded. Good. Outside, the snow finally slowed, the town exhaling after a long night. Caleb walked back to the baby's room, Orion at his side. He stood over the bassinet watching Noah sleep, chest rising steadily. The past had found him, not to punish, but to finish something that had been left undone. Caleb rested a hand on the edge of the bassinet, the other on Orion's shoulder. For the first time since Nolan's last call, Caleb felt the weight shift, not lighter but bearable. The line he had never crossed had been crossed for him, and now he would hold it.